So thanks for tuning in, everyone. My name's Isabella Murphy. I'm from Southern Queensland Landscapes, based here in Toowoomba. I've been working with Jerry Grant from Dirranbandi Landcare to put on this webinar through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program. This program is focused on improving sustainability and productivity of agriculture across the Murray-Darling region. Today we have Damien O'Sullivan to present on weedy lovegrasses, how best to identify them, their impacts on productivity, and how to manage them effectively. Just a few housekeeping things. Please keep your video and audio off. If you have any questions, post them in the chat and Damien will answer them all at the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there's also a short survey that we'd really appreciate if you filled out for us. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube to revisit later. Otherwise, I'm going to pass over to Damien and he'll introduce himself a bit more and get us educated on some lovegrass. Cheers.
Okay, thanks Isabella, and thanks to Southern Queensland Landscapes and Dirranbandi Landcare for organising this webinar. So I've just had quite a long experience with African lovegrass here at Kingaroy and managing it on a property here and looking at different ways of trying to control lovegrass. It seems though that we've got lovegrass that is also causing pretty similar problems. So we'll go through that and have a look at what sort of options people might have for lovegrasses. And for any of you that are now managing those lovegrasses, you know there's no easy answers, and we'll go through what options there might be. So these lovegrasses are just part of that whole group of weedy grasses that we tend to be getting right across Australia at the moment. And as you can see there from the screen, there's quite a huge list of those grasses. And essentially, I suppose, if you look at all those grasses, they really require more intensive management or control for them to be productive. And a lot of these, it's been found with research that if we've got regular fire, it does seem to really favour a lot of these grasses. So obviously there's individual management strategies that you can use for these particular grasses. But generally, I think in a lot of cases with most of them, we're probably better off without them. So what about the lovegrasses? There's probably about 80 different species of lovegrasses in Australia. 15 of them are introduced, and for some of the bigger, taller lovegrasses, the identification of them can be pretty difficult. But the other thing to remember is that we do have some pretty important pasture species like never-fail grass, woolly butt, purple lovegrass, neat lovegrass, delicate lovegrass. They can be all really good pasture species, and a lot of them, quite a few of those are annuals, but they can be good pasture species. We've also got elastic grass, which is an Eragrostis. That's probably one of the ones you might see on a driveway with a lawn where we've got compacted soil, difficult to cut with a lawnmower. And the other one is teff. So that's one of the introduced lovegrasses. It's an annual from Ethiopia, but a pretty good grain crop, and also used a lot for hay. There's some research at the moment that indicates there probably should be about another 14 grasses in that list of lovegrasses. But today we'll concentrate on 3 of these different lovegrasses. So we've got African lovegrass. So it was first introduced in 1947 and has since been planted as a pasture species used for erosion control in New South Wales. And I know in this Burnett district here that at one stage it was grown for seed. And it's also in it's one of those 71 weeds of significance in Australia. So it is quite a problem right across a lot of Australia, as we'll see later. Trichophora lovegrass, there's no real common name for this particular one. And I think we really need to make sure that we decipher between the two of those. So probably the best thing to call it is Trichophora lovegrass. So it seems to have arrived as a contaminant of goods or on people, and was first collected in 1971 in Alice Springs. So it's a pretty recent introduction to Australia compared to the other grasses. If we look at this soft lovegrass, it's probably more of an annual grass. As we'll see later, it's just spread up the coast of Australia more, but and was another early introduction, but it's an annual grass and doesn't seem to cause too many problems at all in the grazing industry. So we'll have a look at the key to identifying lovegrasses, and you can see here is the panicle or seed head of the lovegrass. And generally with lovegrasses, if you look at that seed head, and you can see here, these seeds are in a herringbone shaped pattern. Just every lovegrass that you see, you might have to get some pretty good microscope or glasses to have a look, but you'll generally find most lovegrasses have got that type of, or nearly all have got that type of herringbone pattern seed arrangement. So African lovegrass, as you can see, really well spread along the east coast of Australia, right through to South Australia and Western Australia. And I was amazed a few years ago travelling from Bunbury to Perth just how much of it is there. And we can see it just about on every soil type that we've got across Australia. And obviously it can handle the cool weather in Tasmania and even across the ditch in New Zealand. So a pretty widespread grass. If we compare that to Trichophora, we can see that Trichophora is not as widely spread as African lovegrass. And when you look at some of these records of where Trichophora is, and particularly if you look a bit closer to each particular state, you can generally see that a lot of these records of Trichophora are all along roadsides. So generally it does seem to be being spread along roadsides since that first introduction in 1971. In comparison, Pelosa, that soft lovegrass, we seem to see it more in right along coastal areas, and to my knowledge, it hasn't provided or been a real problem as far as grazing is concerned across a lot of Queensland. But I'll be very interested to hear from anyone that has got a record of it and has had issues with it. So which grass is the problem? Obviously African lovegrass is a real issue across a lot of Australia, widespread with heavy infestations near coastal areas, mainly south of Mackay and along the coastal southern Australia to Western Australia. And as we've just seen in those maps of Australia, Trichophora is has spread from Central Australia, and being a more recent introduction, only since 1971, it's really quite amazing how it's spread over that period of time. And then there's the soft lovegrass. So African lovegrass, native of Tanzania, introduced as a pasture seed contaminant in the 1900s. There's about 6 cultivars of the species, and one of the cultivars, Console, is used as a pasture grass, but there's been about 100 lines of it screened in Australia. So if we look around the world, it's grown on a lot of poor soils as a pasture in Africa, US, Argentina. And in Australia, we see 4 main types. There's the curvular type, what we call Robusta green, tall chloromalus and short chloromalus. So the curvular one tends to be the one that is really weedy and unpalatable, and it's pretty difficult to identify between those types. It seems that the more weedy varieties are more invasive than the others, and I think that's probably to do with lack of their palatability. And if you look at the literature, even in Africa, where it comes from, it's also seen as an invasive species over there in some areas. So it is a tropical plant, a C4 plant. Most of the plants live about 2 to 5 years. We end up with a solid tussock, dries out in the centre. The seeds are viable for 1 to 5 years or have lived up to 26 years. But that depends on what sort of research work that you look at. It's a prolific seeder, so it can produce about 600 kgs of seed per hectare, and we'll see later what that might mean for some people. The one thing about it, it's usually the first grass to go to shoot and seed after a dry period or a drought, and it really does respond quickly to any sort of moisture. That leaf of it's extremely fibrous. Some people say, well, that's because it's got a lot of silica in it, but I think if you look at the comparisons of silica, amount of silica in it with other grasses, it's the form that silica is in that makes it really fibrous and difficult to break up. The root system, when you first look at it, it's very tough and seems pretty shallow, but in trenches I've seen where the roots will go up to about, thin feeder roots will go up to about 3 metres deep. So it brings nutrients up from a long depth. It also shades out its competitors. It does frost, but shoots back readily. It can have sexual reproduction, or can be what we call apomictic, where it just sets a seed, and essentially that seed is a clone of the parent plant. So it's a bit of still a question is that those weedy species, are they selected out by climate or palatability? We just really don't know. There probably hasn't been enough research done on that. So overall, it's a very resilient plant. It's got a low digestibility, probably up to 65% when it's short and green, and can be quite useful then, but protein levels to about below near 3% during winter. So in that sort of situation, you really got to start supplementing cattle, particularly that are feeding on it. It favours any sandy or acidic soils, and if you look at any acidic soils, often if they're acidic, they make aluminium more available in the soil. So African lovegrass and some of these Eragrostis are really tolerant of high aluminium levels in the soil. If you're measuring bricks, very low bricks, and it can also be alleliopathic, which means it releases a chemical that makes it difficult for any other sort of plants to grow around it. So it's got a lot of competitive advantages, this particular plant. So does outcompete any native and introduced grasses, and even if you've got a really good healthy pasture, it has the ability to invade those. Potential to cover a large area of Australia, and I think really deplete the productiveness of many grazing areas. The seed is extremely fine, so it's easily transported. When we see that it's ungrazed, it can form really big tussocks and start to cause a really significant fire hazard. And we've seen some areas in Queensland where it's filled up creek lines, and when there has been eventually a big fire in there, the fires have been hot enough to kill blue gums and things like that. So it's something that really does need a lot more intensive management to make it useful for grazing. The other thing is just simply the fibrous tussock limit movement across paddocks. Very difficult to ride a two-wheeler motorbike across paddocks, and ultimately we end up with this really unproductive monoculture, and does respond to rain at any time of the year. I have seen situations where African lovegrass, if it's in a locked up paddock for about 4 years, it'll tend to die off. So any disturbance does keep the plant growing. And I have seen in this particular year anyway that it does die off if it gets wet feet. So they're probably the few instances where it is not suited to that particular situation. So one of the real competitive advantages this particular grass has got is the time to seeding. So as an example, in the 16th of January, we got some good rain, grass growing rain in 2017. And if you looked at African lovegrass, within 21 days, it had a seed head up and ready to go. Whereas if we compare that to things like our native grasses, centre top, pitted bluegrass, forest bluegrass, or any of the introduced grasses like Digitaria, green panic and Rhodes grass, it's up to 70 days, and we need warmer temperatures and adequate day length before those grasses will start to set seed. And if we look at things like Cyratro, legumes, they're much longer, and things like creeping bluegrass, even up to 85 days. So immediately this grass has got a really big advantage against a lot of our other really important pasture grasses that we've got. So it does have a really large seed set. So what about this Trichophora lovegrass, which is of a real concern in that area around Dirranbandi, right up to Miles, Chinchilla, right along that Warrego Highway. No real common name for it, and it does tend to have a hairier leaf and seed. So the Trichophora just means hair bearing, and that just gives you an indication as to why it's called that. And we see this rapid spread along the roadsides in Queensland, New South Wales and the Northern Territory. And experience from anyone on the Queensland's Western Downs is that it's really quite unpalatable in the paddock, and simply because it's got not a large leaf area, this plant's pretty difficult to control with chemicals. And talking to people, it's just, and seeing for yourself, it's really common along roadsides and any of these pipeline corridors that we do have at the current time. So probably if you're looking for the difference between African lovegrass and Trichophora lovegrass, you can see here really clearly that the node on the stem is a dark green on the African lovegrass. The other thing is that you can see that the seed heads are generally quite green on that African lovegrass. In comparison with Trichophora, you can see that node on the stem is got quite a brown rusty colour, and once again we see much darker seed head and very fine seeds on that seed head. So that gives you a bit of an indication as to the difference between these two weedy lovegrasses. So there's far less known about this species, and in the last few years where it's been particularly dry, it seems to it spreads a lot more. It has a lot less stem, more stem and a lot less leaf than African lovegrass, and obviously very unpalatable. And like African lovegrass, it copes well with these lower fertility soils and the compacted soils that we often see along roadsides. So one of the issues with this grass is it's not seen as a problem species, and what we really need to do with the concern people have had about it is if they've got samples of it, get it checked by the herbarium, and obviously Department of Ag or weeds officers from councils can help you do that, because unless people are making the herbarium aware of the spread and extent of the grass, it's not going to be recognised as a problem. And we've already heard of issues where people have seen this particular grass spread quite widely in their property simply because of utilities driving through the property, spreading it, and then it not being recognised as a problem grass at the present time. So if you are concerned about it, it is worth making sure that you get it properly identified. Okay, so management options for these weedy lovegrasses. There's nothing detailed on Trichophora just simply because of its recent introduction, but we can probably look at some of the controls options that you might have with African lovegrass, and a lot of those options might be applicable to the Trichophora lovegrass. So obviously one of our main concerns is about the palatability of these particular grasses. So what do the cattle think about it? And often a lot of people say to me, oh, there's nothing that bad about African lovegrass, particularly if you're in a drought. And it does provide some dry feed, does respond quickly in a drought, but I think I'd much rather some of the other more palatable grasses. And this is some work done in South Africa. And you can see that things like Digitaria, Green Panic and Lucerne, as far as cattle were concerned, were much more palatable grasses compared to African lovegrass. And in that list of 16 or 17 grasses, as far as palatability is concerned with the legumes, African lovegrass came stone motherless last. So obviously the cattle have made the decision that as far as something to eat, they'd rather another grass in their diet. So it just gives you an indication of how unproductive some of these grasses are. So just an example of some management techniques that have been trialled at Kingaroy, and this is for about 100% African lovegrass in old cultivation paddocks. So in this case, there was about 6 different treatments for some of these paddocks. One was to replant the pasture. One was just to slash the pasture. So with slashing, you leave a lot of, as most of you would know, you just leave a lot of material just on the surface of the slashed grass. So that essentially evaporates away into the air. In comparison, mulching, using a mulcher behind a tractor, cuts a lot of that material up into short pieces, and it tends to sit on the surface of the ground and provide a bit of cover. So in a lot of cases, mulching is probably a bit better than slashing. Burning, we'll look at what the results of burning was, and other options like rotational grazing and high density grazing. So how do they play a role in trying to manage these grasses? So in the plough and replant situation, you start off with a paddock like this, really thick lovegrass, can hardly ride a motorbike through it. You end up, you have to burn it, slash it, plough it. So, and then in this case, there was oats sown with a mixture of other pasture grasses. And at the time that was done, it cost about $571 a hectare, but we did some figures the other day, and if you're going to put lime and fertiliser on, it was about $1,000 a hectare, but unfortunately that was done about a month ago, those figures. So as everyone's well aware, with diesel prices now, that figure's probably gone up again. So it is an expensive business to look at ploughing and replanting these pastures to try and get something better back there. So just some of the results from that, in that particular paddock after it was ploughed up, oats were grazed, and a lot of the pastures did come back into that paddock. One of the interesting things that was in that mix was chicory, and as you can see there pretty clearly that African lovegrass didn't really like to grow too well in that chicory. But over a period of time, that African lovegrass did come back into that pasture. And if you look at that particular pasture today, it's back to a mixture of African lovegrass and Digitaria grass. So Digitaria does seem to compete with it pretty well. And you really need to look at changing the soil conditions that you got to reduce the amount of African lovegrass that might come back. So that can make it into a pretty expensive exercise. So if we look at grazing versus mulching and burning, you can see that heavy grazing leaves pretty good ground cover and does leave the tussock of the plant. Mulching a paddock with a mulcher, you can see that there's good ground cover there. But in the case of burning, you can see that you generally end up with not too much ground cover at all. So in mulching, probably still got 100% ground cover, which is what we're always aiming to do in any grazed pasture. In the grazing, obviously 100% ground cover still there, but in the burning, you tend to lose all that ground cover. And in cases where I saw paddocks burn 2 years in a row, we ended up with no ground cover and a really hard packed baked soil. So it just burns so with such intensity, this grass, that it does seem to destroy a lot of the biology in the soil. So one of the things that we can look at with slashing is there's obviously less growth when we get a regrowth after some rain, whereas some more intensive grazing, we end up with more bulk, and that bulk can be pretty useful if you get into a dry time, and if you've got some supplements, it can be something that can get you through. So grazing is, in a correct manner, can be pretty useful in trying to help control it. So this is just a look at the different amount of grass on the tussock. If it's not slashed or it's slashed, there's obviously less bulk, but it's often more palatable and often greener, and it has a bit more grazing value under that particular situation. So what about high density stocking? And in this case, we're talking about using, say, up to 200 head per hectare for 24 hours, use electric fencing. When you've got that number of stock in a paddock, it's pretty competitive grazing. So everyone that wants a feed needs to just eat whatever they can find. You really do start to reduce the tussock in the dry matter. It does start to open up the space between tussocks for other plants to establish over time. And it seems that the lovegrass tussock recovers with a green leafy growth rather than going to seed. In the case of where you burn it, it always tends to send up a lot of seed heads straight away rather than leaf. So that's probably one of the other detrimental effects of burning. And I think in the long term, this tussock, it does protect the soil from wind and evaporation. So there's less loss of soil moisture. And that tussock does respond pretty quickly to rain. And the other thing is, obviously, if you're making animals eat some unpalatable grass that might be low in protein, the production is going to suffer. So you really need to think about using some sort of protein supplements to help that digestion. One of the advantages of this method is, though, that the manure and urine from the cattle, it is evenly spread right across the paddock. And we've seen dung beetles increase under this sort of high density grazing. And you can use this in areas that might not be suitable for mechanical treatment of the pasture grasses. So this is just a comparison of a paddock here. So that's the electric wire down the middle of the paddock before the cattle have gone in. After that intensive grazing, you can see how the cattle have gone in and carefully selected all that green leaf that they can possibly eat off that grass. And you can see here the cattle in that paddock. And this is that paddock after it's had that treatment right through. So it does seem pretty labour intensive, but does really change the productivity of these low quality grasses like this over a period of time. So what are the outcomes of these various treatments? So if you've got a set stock paddock with these grasses in it, particularly with African lovegrass, you really do get a loss of production. The amount of lovegrass in the paddock tends to increase until you've got a monoculture, and every other plant tends to get overgrazed. If you're looking at ploughing and reseeding a paddock, if that's possible, it's pretty expensive. So you're looking at up to $1,000 a hectare, which is a significant investment to try and do something there. If you're burning, it's cheap, but you really do lose that ground cover and production. And as I said before, you just end up with a huge crop of seed. It does give you probably an opportunity to spray the grass out though, if you are looking at cultivating later on. Slashing, it's pretty expensive. It does spread the seed. It's very slow. It's one of the most, because of the fibrous nature of the plant, extremely difficult to slash. There's some old costs there at $60 a hectare, but obviously they're gone out the window with diesel prices at the current time. Mulching with a wider machine is seems to be quite a bit cheaper and seems to work a bit better. There's often more leaf comes back, but another option that is really quite expensive. So probably the best option today is to spend the time on more intensive grazing rather than any of those other ways of managing the problem. And I suppose in a lot of cases, it depends on whether you've got 100% of the paddock covered with a weedy grass like African lovegrass, or is it 50% or 20%? And that's when you've got to make the decision as to what is going to be my best option to manage these particular weedy species. So obviously chemical treatment is an option. So spraying out with glyphosate, you're looking at about $82 a hectare. If you want to use flupropionate, up to about $104 a hectare. The flupropionate granules, some people have used them. That starts to work out a fair bit of money at $461 a hectare. And the supply of flupropionate at the current time is out to about 6 months away. It hasn't been noticed or hasn't been noted, but whether there's any resistance to flupropionate from African lovegrass, but there is some work being done in New South Wales on that at the moment, but there is some definite resistance to flupropionate by Chilean needlegrass. So we need to be really careful in using these chemicals to ensure that resistance to the chemicals just doesn't happen. And the trouble with using any of these chemicals is that you spray it out, but then you end up with a bare paddock, and often that brings another plethora of weeds, but maybe that variety of weeds might come and help save the soil in the short term. But if you are spraying out large areas, you really need to think about what's my strategy for trying to introduce a different pasture into this paddock. Obviously, if you've got small amounts of these plants around, you really want to try and keep them under control, and that might mean spot spraying. So spot spraying with glyphosate, it is pretty susceptible to glyphosate, so that works pretty well. And there is a really good example in the South Burnett here of a particular landholder out at Geelong that for the last 15 years that I've known him, he's always travels around in his ute with a small knapsack in the back of his ute, and north and south of Geelong, if you're ever through there, probably about 5 kilometres north, south, east and west, he's kept African lovegrass off the road there, and it has really paid out in that area that he's been able to reduce the spread of African lovegrass in that area along the roadsides. The other option is to treat with flupropionate granules, and just bear in mind it's a chemical that relies on that soil activation. So you can throw out the granules, or you can use flupropionate, but it does need moisture or rain to get it into the soil, and then it's taken up by the plant through the roots. So a different system, but also a useful chemical that can help control, especially spot infestations of these plants, if you might have them. Okay, so some of the other work that has been done, there was some fertiliser studies done at Millmerran to look at whether fertiliser could increase the palatability of African lovegrass, and this has been done on things like giant rat-tail grass and does seem to be an option. So if you've got large areas of these weedy grasses, it's worth doing some trials yourself to look at whether you can increase the palatability of the grass by using fertiliser. In Argentina, there's some figures from Argentina where they do use urea on African lovegrass to increase its palatability and production. And you can see there that in that blue column, that in their summer, that there's some quite significant increases in production by using urea on these African lovegrass. So the other thing to think about is competitive grass species. So Pangala has been found to compete really well with African lovegrass. It's creeping grass. You obviously have to rest it, but I've seen some areas where it's actually choked out the African lovegrass over a period of time if the grazing management allows it to get away. But you do have to propagate it by runners. Jarrah digit grass, another one that will compete pretty well with it if it's in a pasture. And the creeping bluegrasses, things like hatch or bisset, but creeping bluegrass are really quite good at competing with it. So that begs the question, are there other ways? And there is a biological control project in Southern Australia at the current time that's getting underway. So it's looking at any sort of options that there might be for biologic control, and whether that be by an insect or a disease or things like a particular fungus. It's probably unknown at the moment, but that work is getting underway at the current time, and that might be a future thing that might be useful. So generally, and Southern Queensland Landscapes ran a good webinar on weed hygiene and how to clean vehicles up, but you really need to think about how you can manage these weeds, particularly these ones that tend to spread along roadsides. So with slashes are probably one of the worst things for spreading a lot of these weeds along roadsides and in paddocks. And if people have got to slash these paddocks, well, they really need to think about having a blower on the slasher to because slashers are great seed harvesters. Obviously, graders and vehicles are also an issue. And you can see a photo of a vehicle I took at a field day with a bull bar like that, and it was very effectively harvesting any weeds on the side of the road or grasses on the side of the road and spreading them all over the country. So it just shows you how easily these weedy grasses can spread at the current time. So on property, obviously tracks, along tracks is where these things generally first appear, and it's pretty, if there's anything unusual, grasses you don't know along tracks, it's worth finding out what they are. The trouble with these love grasses is often they're pretty insidious. You don't notice them in their early stages, and it's often not until you get a large patch of these grasses that you tend to realise that something's wrong, and this plant isn't being grazed like our other more preferential pasture species. The other thing is don't move any stock on wet days. These grasses, the seeds adhere or stick to animals and vehicles very well, particularly on wet days. The other thing is to try and isolate in areas, and you might do that by temporary electric fencing, keeping animals out of those areas while you're working on treating them. And if you are treating areas, you might have lightly infested areas. You need to think about where animals are going to minimise the spread that might happen there. And obviously, any areas where you do find patches of these grasses, you just got to go back really quite regularly to clean up those initial infestations you might have. Electricity lines, earth moving equipment, soil movement, all issues, and the mining and gas industry moving around is also causes issues. And one of the things that I've seen some people do is just have a vehicle on their property. Sorry, no one else can drive a vehicle here. If you need a vehicle, use this particular one that we know that's clean on our property. So there's those sorts of methods you can use to try and reduce the spread of these particular plants. In 2019, I got a phone call from a person in the Burner district that sells a lot of hay down there, and he said to me, he said, there's a lot of African lovegrass hay for sale up there at the moment. It's not that bad a weed, is it? And I said to this fella, well, I don't think you're going to have a very good reputation if you introduce that to the area down there. So obviously with fodder introductions, you've got to be really careful that they're not coming in. The other thing is about introducing stock from areas that might have these grasses, and a research project at Brian Pastures near Gayndah found that there's about 47% African lovegrass seed was still viable after it passed through cattle. The other thing is that, as most of you all know, there's not one silver bullet for this. You need lots of different methods combined to try and control the spread and the number of these weedy grasses. So research, where to from here? Well, there's a lot more we need to know about basic plant ecology. Given the spread of that trichophora lovegrass, we really need to think about and do a weed assessment. If you suspect you've got trichophora, it's well worth getting that properly identified. Some of these love grasses can be useful, so there could be some sort of breeding program to improve those particular lines that are useful. I think soil biology can have a lot to do with it. Love grasses seem to really enjoy low phosphorus soils, so soil biology can increase that. Obviously grazing trials, fertiliser and mineral amendments to try and improve the ability of other grasses to compete with love grass is something worthwhile looking at. As I said before, there's that biological control project, but it might be difficult with all the native love grasses that we have. And obviously in any pasture, the more legumes we've got, the better. Increases the digestibility of any pasture and can have a really major effect on production. So in conclusion, any of these weedy love grasses are really unproductive invaders. If you've got grasses that you're not sure what they are, find out what they are. So an early warning of any invasion really does pay off. And the message is, if you've got none, keep it out. If you've got large areas, in a lot of cases, you've just got to learn to live with it, unfortunately. And you need to think about what sort of changes in pasture management you can use to try and maintain some productivity. So some of the trials we've seen, this high density grazing has probably been a better option if you're able to do that. And the other thing is to carry out some of your own trials, because as you've seen, some of the methods of dealing with these grasses can be really quite expensive. So a few trial sites with soil tests can be a really useful way of seeing if some of these options can work for you. So I'll leave it there, but I just thought I would show you this African lovegrass. This is January 2021 in South Africa. They were harvesting it for pasture seed. They're making hay out of it and selling the seed for $10 Australian a kilogram. So they were getting about 500 kgs of seed per hectare off lovegrass. So in not all situations is it, and this was just African lovegrass, so in not all situations is it seen as a problem. They are utilising it. And this particular one here was African lovegrass in a pasture. There was a lot of lucerne in that pasture, and when you looked at their native grasses there, you could work out why they thought that African lovegrass was a better option than some of their native grasses. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Isabella, if there's questions.
Thanks, Damien. That was awesome. It seems you've covered off a lot of information that people were after. There's not a huge amount of questions. But Jamin has messaged in saying, why does nothing seem to grow between the African lovegrass tussocks? Does it let off a toxin or does it just deplete the nutrients around them?
Yeah, well, a lot of the work has shown overseas that it is allelopathic, so it does release chemicals that reduce the chance of any other pastures or grasses growing around there. And that's essentially, you've really got to look at, if you've got that situation, is try and open up that pasture to give the opportunity for some other grasses or even weeds to come back in there to hopefully colonise that and reduce the effects of that shading and those chemicals that the plant releases. So yeah, there's no easy answer for any of it, unfortunately.
No, that sounds good.
Bruce from Crow's Nest. Excuse me. Damien, I've used fluoropropionate on African lovegrass, and it did eliminate the lovegrass, but it seemed to especially sterilise the soil, and nothing much else grew except fleabane and other undesirable weeds. Has that been your experience with fluoropropionate?
So did you spray or use granules?
Sprayed it with a quick spray unit.
Okay. Fluopropionate's an interesting chemical in that if you can get the application rate exactly correct, I've seen cases where paddocks have been sprayed out, they've been able to kill the African lovegrass and leave the native grasses behind. But the trouble with fluopropionate is you need to have the exact rate for it to be able to be used as a selective chemical. So in a lot of cases, it is really difficult to get that exact rate. If you've got that exact rate, it will take out just the African lovegrass and leave the other grasses there. But in a lot of cases, if you put it on at a higher rate, it will kill everything. And obviously then you end up with bare soil, unfortunately, and that's when you do get those weed infestations that come in then. But I think if you do have that case, I think it's an opportunity to make sure that if you do have those bare patches, it's an opportunity to throw things around like some creeping bluegrass seed or some digitaria seed or something like that to try and obviously fluopropionate, depending on the weather that you got and the soil that you got. If you've got heavier soils, it'll stay in the soil longer. If you've got lighter granite soils and you have heavy rainfall, it'll generally get washed out of the profile. So there's probably an opportunity to get some other grasses in there while you do have that bare soil there. Right,
the Pengola grass, would it be suitable for the northeast downs?
Yeah, well, I would certainly give it a try because I've just seen it's very labour intensive to get it in there and get it started, but I've seen some really fantastic results on light soils where it's competed very well with African lovegrass.
Right. Does it in turn have a high fuel load?
No, because it's so palatable. Cattle will generally eat the whole lot out.
Right.
You know, the really high fuel load we get with African lovegrasses, if they've got the abilities to select other grasses, they're going to leave it every time, and that's when we end up with those really high fuel loads that cause all the problem when we get a big fire.
Yes. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. We've also had Doug message in saying, what's the recommended practice for non-pasture areas in trap rock country? Is chemical treatment the only real option?
Yeah, well, after spending about 4 days in Stanthorpe about 3 weeks ago, and you see the extent there once again of the African lovegrass infestation, it's difficult to know what to do, particularly in that trap rock country. Obviously, you can treat with chemicals, but it's, as you've seen, it's a really expensive business. And I think it's probably some more intensive grazing to open up the sward. Obviously, this production of stock's going to suffer a bit under that more intensive grazing, but with some spelling and intensive grazing, I can see that opening up country a lot more. But it's something that you've just got to weigh up. You do see a lot of chemical that is wasted on country that is sprayed or have had flupropanate on it, and without really good management and putting in other grass species, you're going to end up with the same thing in about 2 or 3 years' time, or less even. So yeah, it's a very careful balancing act to try and work out what your best option is.
Rightio. Have we got any more questions? Anything we've missed? Nope. It sounds like we might have answered everything, Damien.
Okay, I don't think we would have answered everything, but I'm certainly happy to talk to anyone if they'd like discuss anything further, and obviously any of that information we can make available to people too.
100%. No, that was really good. That was super interesting. So thank you for that. Thanks again to yourself, and thanks to Dirranbandi Landcare. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. Once you click off the webinar, there will be a quick survey. Would really appreciate if you filled that out. Southern Queensland Landscapes regularly facilitates events like this, so we're always looking to improve everything we're doing. I hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll see you at the next one.